The moon had always been a difficult place to work on, but that day it felt even more hostile than usual. The sky was covered with thick silver clouds that moved like fast waves across the horizon. The surface trembled from time to time, as if the ground itself wanted to warn anyone still standing on it. The research crew rushed toward their shuttle with heavy steps, trying to escape before the storms grew stronger. They had finished their mission, or at least that was what they told themselves. But in truth, something important was being left behind. A large albino dragon lay near a broken ridge not far from their campsite. Her pale scales were scratched and stained with dust, and her wings were folded tight against her body. She breathed slowly, her chest rising with effort. Curled beside her were several tiny hatchlings, their scales still soft, their eyes only half open. The crew had considered them too dangerous to handle and too complicated to bring back. They were in a hurry to leave, and fear mixed with frustration had controlled their decisions. So the crew made a choice that no one wanted to say out loud. They walked away. At a distance, a lone human engineer watched the entire scene from the edge of a damaged storage unit. He had stayed behind to secure the equipment and check the last readings. When he saw the dragon and her young abandoned like discarded objects, something inside him tightened. He knew the species was feared across many colonies. Dragons were strong, fast, and fiercely protective. Many called them untamable. Many believed they attacked without warning. Stories had painted them as nothing but threats. But what he saw in that moment did not match those stories. The dragon was hurt. Her movements were slow, careful. She kept pulling her young close whenever the wind picked up, shielding them from dust that blew across the cracked terrain. Even though her strength was nearly gone, she never stopped guarding them. The engineer could see the rise and fall of her breath, each one shaky, as if even that simple act took too much energy. He checked the crew's report on his wrist device. They had documented the dragon as unrecoverable and marked the hatchlings as unlikely to survive transport. It was a quick way of saying they were not worth saving. The engineer understood the pressures of missions like this. Time, risk, cost. All of these pushed people to make harsh decisions. But he also knew that sometimes the right thing was not the easiest thing. He stood alone in the wind for a few seconds, trying to convince himself to walk back to the shuttle. The storms were growing worse. The ground was unstable, and approaching a mother dragon, especially one that believed her children were in danger, was something most people would never attempt. Still, he couldn't move his feet toward the shuttle. Instead, he found himself stepping closer to the ridge where the dragon lay. Not too close, but close enough to see more clearly. Her eyes followed him, glowing faintly under the strange light of the moon. She didn't lift her head to attack, but she didn't relax either. She was waiting to see what he would do. The engineer knew he had to prepare before acting. If he rushed toward her without a plan, she would see him as a threat. So he returned to the storage unit and quickly opened one of the supply cases. Inside were tools, small energy modules, a portable heat unit, and pieces of protective gear. He worked fast but carefully, assembling what he needed. He created a small mobile shield generator and attached it to his arm. Then he built a temporary field cage that could project a gentle barrier around the dragons if needed, not to trap them, but to block the falling debris from the storms. He packed soft nutrient packs designed for creatures with sensitive digestion. They weren't dragon food, but they were safe and could give the hatchlings a little strength. He took a few deep breaths before stepping outside again. The wind had grown colder. Dust spun around like tiny needles, hitting his visor. He activated the mobile shield, and a faint glow surrounded him. As he approached the ridge again, the dragon pushed her wings in front of the hatchlings, trying to cover them. She gave a low sound, something between a warning and a plea. He stopped several meters away and gently set down the box of supplies. He didn't touch anything yet. He simply sat on the ground, slowly lowering himself to show he wasn't rushing or attacking. The dragon watched him closely, her eyes narrowed, but not wild. The hatchlings made soft noises, tiny clicks and chirps, unaware of the danger around them. He opened the box slowly and took out the heat unit. It was small, about the size of his hand. When activated, it released a steady, warm glow. He placed it on the ground between them. The warmth spread across the air despite the wind. One of the hatchlings, the smallest one, lifted its head at the sudden comfort. It didn't crawl forward, but it chirped louder. The engineer spoke, even though he knew she couldn't understand his words. His tone was low, calm, like speaking to a scared animal back on his home world. He told her he wasn't there to harm them. He told her he only wanted to help. His voice was dry from the dust, but he kept speaking, hoping his tone alone would reassure her. After a long moment, the dragon shifted slightly. She didn't move toward him, but she didn't push the heat unit away with her claws. That was the first sign of trust he received. It was small, but it was enough. He opened the nutrient packs next. The wind tried to pull them from his hands, but he held on. He placed them near the heat unit, still maintaining a safe distance. The smallest hatchling took a hesitant step forward, then another, until it reached the pack. The dragon lifted her wing, watching carefully but not stopping the little one. It bit gently into the soft packet, tasting the food. Its weak body trembled a bit, but it kept eating. The engineer felt his chest lighten. If the hatchlings ate, they had a chance. He didn't move any closer. He stayed exactly where he was, letting the little one explore safely. The other hatchlings began to show interest, raising their heads at the smell. The mother watched them and then looked at the engineer again. Her breathing was still heavy, but her eyes no longer burned with fear. There was now something else in them, caution, mixed with a thin thread of hope. The sky darkened suddenly as the storm grew stronger. The ground trembled under his feet. He knew he didn't have much time left. He needed to bring them to shelter soon, but he couldn't rush the process. Trust could not be forced. It had to be allowed to grow naturally, even in dangerous moments. He stayed there for a long time, letting the heat unit warm them and the hatchlings eat. He talked to the dragon in a calm voice, letting her hear the steadiness in his tone. The storm roared in the distance, but he didn't leave. He didn't run. He stayed until the dragon lowered her head slightly, blinking in a slow, tired way that told him she understood he meant no harm. In that moment, surrounded by dust and wind on a dying moon, a fragile connection formed between a human and a creature most people feared. It wasn't friendship yet. It wasn't full trust. But it was the beginning of something neither of them expected. And the engineer knew that whatever happened next, he couldn't walk away like the others did. He wouldn't leave them to face the storm alone. The engineer stood near the ridge long after the hatchlings finished their small meal. The storm clouds overhead kept thickening, rolling across the sky like giant waves. Each tremor from the ground reminded him that time was slipping away. He knew the dragon family wouldn't survive if they stayed out in the open much longer. The moon's fragile crust was cracking deeper each hour, and the temperature was dropping faster than his suit could recalibrate. He looked at the mother dragon again. Her breath was still slow and uneven, and her wings trembled every time she adjusted her position. She tried to lift herself once, but her legs shook and she stopped, lowering her body carefully so she wouldn't crush her young. It was clear she had reached her limit. Even if she wanted to escape the collapsing terrain, she physically couldn't. The hatchlings huddled against her belly, chirping softly, sensing her weakness. The engineer felt a tightness in his throat. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't even someone who worked directly with wildlife. He was just a repair specialist, someone who fixed machinery, ran diagnostics, and solved technical problems. Saving a dragon and her babies wasn't something he had ever prepared for. Yet, he couldn't ignore the pull he felt inside him, a quiet but strong feeling that told him he had to do something. He stepped back slowly and tapped his wrist device. A small map of the area appeared, marking unstable zones with glowing red lines. Their location was right on the edge of a fault line. Another heavy tremor and the entire ridge might collapse. He turned off the map and walked toward the supply unit nearby. The wind pushed against him, making each step harder. Dust hit his helmet like tiny stones. He reached the storage crates and pulled out a few more tools energy clamps, support rods, and a collapsible sled designed for transporting equipment. It wasn't meant for living creatures, especially not a dragon, but he could modify it. He had ideas forming already. If he reinforced the edges and widened the base with support rods, it might hold her weight long enough to reach shelter. He placed everything in a line and started working. His fingers moved quickly, tightening clamps, extending metal frames, and linking power nodes. He removed extra panels from his own transport case to use as stabilizers. Every minute he lost meant more danger for the dragon family, so he worked faster than usual. Sparks flashed from the connectors as he fused metal parts together. The wind tried to interfere, tossing dust between wires, but he shielded the tools with his arms and kept going. As he worked, he kept glancing back at the dragon. She hadn't moved much. Her head rested on the cold ground, her eyes half open, tracking him in tired, careful motions. The hatchlings crawled around her belly, sometimes climbing on her tail, unaware of how fragile their situation was. He wished he could tell her what he was building. He wished she could understand that he wasn't abandoning them like the others did. But he knew trust wasn't something that came quickly, especially from a creature that had only ever seen humans act out of fear. By the time he finished shaping the sled, the wind had grown stronger. The sky flashed with distant bursts of light from the rising storm. He attached a small energy engine to the back of the sled and tested it. It hummed quietly, releasing a soft glow. It wasn't powerful, but it would help him pull the weight across the rough ground. He took a deep breath and returned to the dragon. She raised her head slightly when he approached. Her wings twitched, but she didn't spread them out to threaten him. She seemed too exhausted for that dot. He stopped a few meters away again and spoke softly, keeping his movements slow. He didn't know if his voice mattered, but the calm rhythm of speaking seemed to help both of them. He pointed toward the sled and then toward the dragon, trying to show his intentions. She blinked once, long and slow, her eyes cloudy from pain. The hatchlings watched him curiously, their tiny necks stretching. The ground shook suddenly with a deeper tremor than before. Rocks shifted along the ridge, and a loud crack echoed nearby. The dragon flinched and curled her wings around her babies. The engineer stumbled, but regained balance quickly. He knew that was the warning he could not ignore. He stepped forward another half-meter. The dragon gave a faint rumble, not angry but uncertain. He knelt again, moving slowly, letting her see everything he did. He took out the heat unit and placed it closer to her. Hoping she'd understand, he wanted to help her move. The hatchlings crawled toward it again, chirping in excitement. Their tiny bodies glowed softly under the warm light. The mother dragon watched her young, then looked at the engineer. She made a low, tired sound, something between a growl and a breath. It wasn't a threat. It felt almost like permission fragile, hesitant permission. He took that chance. He activated the field cage and extended it gently toward her side. The soft barrier wrapped around her wings and body, not touching her, but creating a protective shield that would absorb debris and lessen vibrations. She didn't resist. She simply closed her eyes for a moment, as if accepting that she couldn't do this alone anymore. The engineer carefully lifted the first hatchling. It was lighter than he expected, warm and soft. The tiny creature chirped in confusion, but didn't struggle. He placed it in the insulated pod on the sled. Then he lifted the second hatchling. And then the third, each one reacting with little noises, but no fear. When he reached the last hatchling, the smallest one he had seen earlier, it looked up at him with wide, curious eyes. Its pale scales shimmered under the faint moonlight. The little creature touched his glove with its tiny snout, almost like a greeting. He couldn't help but smile behind his helmet dot. Now came the most difficult part. He moved to the mother dragon's side. She was still lying down, breathing unevenly. Her tail curled protectively around her body, but she didn't raise it to strike. He placed a gentle hand on one of the support rods of the field cage, activating a soft lifting mechanism. The cage hummed and slightly raised her weight, making it easier to slide her onto the reinforced sled. She groaned in pain, but didn't lash out. He whispered to her softly, telling her he was almost done. The ground trembled again, sending small rocks tumbling down the ridge. He moved faster now, pushing and guiding the sled under her body. The energy engine vibrated as it adjusted to her weight. When he finally managed to settle her onto the sled, the dragon breathed out heavily, her body sinking into the new support. Her wings rested loosely against her sides. She watched him with the same cautious look, but now there was something gentler in her eyes, an understanding that he wasn't her enemy. The hatchlings chirped inside their pods, sensing the movement. The smallest one bounced slightly, tapping its pod with excitement. The engineer checked each pod to make sure they were secure. The storm winds roared behind him, pushing sand across the ridge. He grabbed the pull handles on the front of the sled. It was heavy, far heavier than anything he had ever moved before. But he didn't hesitate. He leaned forward and began to drag. The sled moved only a few inches at first, scraping against the rock. He pulled harder, digging his feet into the ground. His muscles strained, his arms burned, but the sled moved a bit more. The moon rumbled again, louder this time. A small section of the ridge broke off behind them, falling into a deep crack with a heavy crash. Dust exploded into the air. The dragon's eyes widened, panic flashing in them. She looked at her hatchlings, then at the engineer. He pulled harder. He kept dragging, step by step, forcing his body to keep going even as his legs shook. The shelter was far, but not unreachable. The wind roared, debris flew, and the ground threatened to give way at any moment. Still, he didn't stop. He wasn't saving a dangerous creature. He was saving a mother. He was saving babies who didn't understand why the world was falling apart around them. He was saving a family, Dot, and deep down, he knew he couldn't fail them, Dot. Not now. Not after everything. The sled moved unevenly across the rough ground as the engineer kept pulling with all the strength he had left. Every muscle in his back felt tight. Every step felt heavier than the last, and the storm behind them kept growing louder. The sky looked darker than before, almost as if night had arrived early, even though it wasn't supposed to. The wind blew so hard, it nearly pushed him sideways, but he kept going. He kept checking the dragon to make sure she was still conscious. She lay low on the sled, her wings folded tight against her sides, her breathing slow and shallow. Her eyes flickered open from time to time, watching him, watching her babies, watching the sky as if she feared it would crush them at any moment. The hatchlings inside their pods chirped softly, the smallest one tapping weakly on the clear surface. Trying to understand what was happening, he kept speaking to the mother dragon whenever he could catch his breath. His voice cracked under the dry air and strain, but he didn't stop. He told her they were close to safety. He told her he wouldn't let the storms take them. He told her that even though they didn't understand each other's words, they had to trust each other. The moon rumbled again. This time the shaking felt deeper, like the entire crust was stretching apart. Small cracks appeared ahead of him, glowing faintly from the energy building under the surface. He quickly pulled the sled to the right, avoiding a widening fissure. The sled jerked sharply, and the dragon let out a low sound of pain. He apologized under his breath, slowing down just enough to steady her before pulling again. He could feel his heartbeat pounding in his ears. Sweat rolled down his back under the suit, but the cold wind made him shiver. His grip tightened on the sled handles until his fingers ached. The shelter wasn't far, now only a few hundred meters, but with the storm worsening and the ground breaking apart, it felt like miles. A new burst of wind struck him from behind, and he stumbled forward. The sled slid a little faster than he expected, and he hurried to keep control so the dragon wouldn't roll or lose balance. A piece of metal debris from the abandoned camp flew past them, spinning wildly before slamming into a rock and breaking apart. The dragon's eyes widened, her tail tightening instinctively around the sled's side rails. Another tremor shook the ground, and a large section of the ridge ahead collapsed. Dust shot upward like a giant cloud, making it hard to see anything clearly for a moment. The engineer stopped pulling and covered his visor with his arm. The dust stung as it hit, and he coughed inside the suit. When the dust began to settle, he saw something that made his chest tighten. A narrow path still existed, but the edges were unstable, with loose stones and cracks forming every second. It was their only route. If he waited too long, the path might close completely. He turned to the dragon. Her eyes were half open, tired but alert. She watched him as if she knew what he was thinking. The smallest hatchling chirped again, a weak little sound that somehow made the moment feel even heavier. He didn't speak this time. Words wouldn't make it easier. He leaned forward, tightened his grip on the handles, and pulled. The sled scraped across the rocky surface. He leaned his entire body weight into it, using every bit of strength left in him. His boots sank slightly into the dirt as he dragged the heavy load forward inch by inch. His arms shook from exhaustion. The wind hit him again, pushing against his back like an invisible weight. The path ahead grew narrower. The ground both sides crumbled slowly toward the gorge below. He moved faster, knowing he could not afford to hesitate. The sled bounced over a sharp edge, and the dragon groaned softly, her claws gripping the sled frame. He whispered calm words again, hoping she would understand the comforting tone. The hatchlings chirped louder this time. They could feel the movement, the shaking, and the tension in the air. One of the pods tilted slightly, and the engineer quickly reached back with one hand to steady it while still pulling the sled with the other. It wasn't easy, but he didn't allow himself to lose control. His legs burned with pain, but he pushed harder, dragging the sled across the narrowest part of the path. The ground beneath them trembled again, a long rumbling tremor that felt stronger than all the ones before it. A large piece of the ridge above broke off and rolled down toward them. He saw it too late. A dark shadow moved across the ground as the rock tumbled closer. He tried to move the sled faster, but the weight made it impossible. He covered his head instinctively as the rock bounced toward them, sending chunks of stone flying in every direction. Suddenly, a loud crack sounded behind him. The dragon, who had been lying weakly on the sled moments ago, forced herself upright. She spread one wing, using it like a shield. Her wing took the hit from the falling rock, the impact strong enough to send a deep vibration through the sled. Dust flew everywhere as the rock smashed apart. Against her wing's strong bone structure, the engineer froze for a moment in shock. She had protected him, even in her fragile condition, even with her body shaking from exhaustion. She had risen to block the falling debris from hitting him directly. Her wing dropped back onto the sled afterward, trembling from the force of the blow. She let out a strained exhale and lay still again. He stared at her for a moment, his throat tight. No matter what others had believed about her kind, She had risked the last bit of her strength to keep him safe. That thought filled him with new determination. He moved faster now, driven by something stronger than fear or exhaustion. He kept dragging, step after step, until at last he saw the edge of the sheltered area ahead, half buried under dust, but still intact. A protective metal arch blocked most of the wind, and emergency lights flashed dimly from inside. He pulled the sled across the last stretch of unstable ground and into the sheltered zone. The moment they passed through the metal arch, the wind outside roared even louder, as if angry that they had escaped. He let go of the sled handles and dropped to his knees, breathing hard. His chest rose and fell rapidly as he tried to catch his breath. His legs felt like they were made of heavy stone. His arms throbbed with deep pain, but they were safe. The dragon lay on the sled, her head resting on the metal surface. Her breathing was weak, but steadier than before. The hatchlings chirped inside their pods, confused but safe, their tiny bodies glowing faintly under the warm lights of the shelter. The engineer stood slowly and began checking the shelter systems. He activated the internal heaters, sealed the doors, and turned on the med-scan panel. The warm air inside helped the dust settle off his suit. He walked back to the sled and gently checked each hatchling. They responded with tiny movements, pressing their noses against the pod walls. He made sure they were warm and that their breathing was stable. Then he moved to the mother dragon. She opened her eyes, weak but aware. She watched him with the same cautious expression she had used earlier. But now there was something deeper behind it, something close to trust. He placed the heat unit near her head, letting the warmth spread across her scales. Her breathing eased slightly. She blinked once, slowly, as if thanking him in the only way she could. He sat beside her, exhausted but relieved. The storm outside roared like an angry giant, but inside the shelter there was calm. A human and a dragon family rested side by side, bound not by words, but by survival and a fragile, growing bond. The engineer leaned back against the wall, eyes half closed. He knew the danger wasn't over. The moon was still unstable. The crew would eventually notice he wasn't on the shuttle. There would be questions, maybe even trouble for him, but none of that mattered right now. He had saved them, and somehow, in the middle of a collapsing world, they had saved him too. The shelter walls trembled lightly as the storm outside grew stronger. The engineer sat near the sled, watching the mother dragon's slow breathing. Her body was still weak, but the warmth inside the shelter helped her relax. The hatchlings were finally quiet, curled inside their pods as if they understood they were safe for the moment. Only the smallest one kept tapping its tiny nose against the pod wall, making a soft sound that almost felt like a whisper in the silent room. He rubbed his tired eyes and stood up. He hadn't rested since the morning, and every muscle in his body felt strained. But he couldn't stop now. If the storm grew any worse, or if the moon's crust shifted again, this shelter might not hold. He needed to find a way to move the dragon family to the main base, where real medical tools and stable rooms existed. He walked to the control panel in the corner and tried to activate the communication channel. The screen flickered, but didn't connect. The storm interference was too strong. He tried again with manual settings, adjusting the frequency slowly, but the result didn't change. The storm had cut off the signal completely. He sighed and leaned against the wall, feeling the smooth metal cold under his back. He looked at the dragon and her hatchlings again. He couldn't contact the others. He couldn't call for transport. And he couldn't leave the shelter on foot until the storm passed. His mind raced, thinking of possible plans. Maybe he could use the maintenance crawler parked outside the shelter. He had seen it earlier when he first arrived on the moon. It wasn't designed for living passengers, but with some adjustments, he could attach the modified sled behind it. The crawler's engine was strong enough to pull heavy loads, even across unstable ground. But there was a problem. The crawler was outside, half buried under dust and debris from earlier tremors. It would take time, tools, and a lot of strength to free it. And every minute spent outside meant fighting against a storm that could throw rocks like bullets. He walked to the shelter door and looked through the small viewing window. The wind was so strong that it blurred the landscape. Dust spun in circles like wild spirits, and cracks glowed faintly under the scattered pieces of broken ground. The storm outside wasn't just strong, it was dangerous enough to tear apart equipment if it wasn't handled properly. He turned back toward the dragon. The mother lifted her head slightly, her eyes following him. Even though she was weak, she still watched every move he made. The bond between them felt deeper now. Earlier, she had protected him without hesitating, even though she could barely stand. That moment stayed in his mind like a bright spark. It reminded him that their survival was connected now. He crouched beside her carefully, giving her space. She slowly shifted, adjusting her wings so she could see him more clearly. He spoke to her in a calm voice, explaining what he needed to do. He didn't know if she understood the words, but she seemed to grasp the tone. Her eyes softened slightly, and her tail relaxed a little. He checked the hatchlings again. They were warm, breathing softly. The smallest one pressed its tiny claws against the pod wall when it saw him, chirping faintly as if asking where he was going. He touched the pod gently and tried to smile, though he was exhausted. He turned back to the door. He had made a choice. He had to go out there. If he didn't, they would all be trapped until the storm tore the shelter apart. If he could get the crawler running, he could move the dragon family to safety before the moon surface became too unstable. He took a deep breath, grabbed his toolkit, and tightened the seals on his suit. Before stepping out, he glanced at the dragon again. She lowered her head, making a soft, low sound, almost like a worried sigh. He nodded slowly to reassure her. The moment he stepped outside, the wind slammed against him so hard he stumbled. Dust hit his visor like a swarm of tiny insects. He leaned forward, pushing against the storm with slow but steady steps. Each movement felt like walking through thick water. The crawler was only a short distance away, but in the storm it felt far. Its metal frame was half covered by dust and rocks. A large piece of debris was wedged under one of its wheels. He dug his boots into the ground and began pulling the debris away. The wind pushed his body sideways, and more dust piled on top of the crawler as he worked. He tried to pull the debris again, this time using a metal rod to loosen it. His arms shook from the strain. He could feel the storm pulling at the rod, trying to drag it out of his hands. After several minutes of struggling, the debris finally shifted and rolled down the slope. He quickly moved to the crawler's control panel. The screen was covered in dust, so he wiped it clean with his glove. He tapped the power button. The crawler hummed weakly, lights flickering. He tried again. The engine clicked, but didn't start. He checked the side panel, opened the maintenance hatch, and began adjusting the energy modules. His fingers moved quickly, guided by experience and desperation. Another tremor shook the ground beneath him. He nearly lost his balance, grabbing the crawler for support. A long crack opened behind him, glowing faintly. He knew he didn't have much time. He reconnected the main energy link and tried the startup again. This time, the crawler rumbled louder, lights stabilizing. The engine turned on, vibrating with steady power. Relief washed over him, and he let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He climbed into the crawler and drove it slowly toward the shelter. The front lights cut through the dust, revealing broken ground and flying debris. Every few seconds, the crawler shook from the wind or rolled over uneven terrain, but the engine held strong. When he reached the shelter entrance, He parked the crawler and ran inside. He shut the door behind him quickly, breathing hard. His suit was covered in dust, and his hands were shaking from the cold and strain. The mother dragon lifted her head again when he entered. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw the dust and damage on his suit. She let out a low sound, softer than before, almost like she was worried about him. He approached her and gently placed a hand against the sled frame. He told her they were leaving. He told her he had found a way to move them. The dragon blinked slowly, her breathing steadying as if she understood that hope had returned. He began preparing the sled again. He tightened the straps, checked the support rods, made sure the hatchling's pods were secure. The smallest one chirped loudly this time, tapping the wall of its pod with excitement or worry. He couldn't tell which. When everything was ready, he opened the shelter door once more. The wind rushed in immediately, making the dragon tense. He pulled the sled forward, guiding it outside as the storm pushed against them. He secured the sled to the crawler with strong cables. The dragon's breathing quickened, but she remained still, trusting him. He climbed into the crawler seat and activated the engine. The machine roared, wheels gripping the unstable ground. The sled jerked slightly, but the cables held tight. He drove slowly, carefully, avoiding large cracks and loose rocks. The storm didn't show mercy. Dust swirled everywhere, and every tremor threatened to throw them off balance. The crawler shook violently at times, but the engineer forced himself to stay focused. He kept glancing at the rear camera where the dragon lay, her wings tight, her eyes half open but alert. The hatchlings huddled in their pods, glowing faintly. At one point, a huge section of the ground ahead collapsed into a deep crater. He swerved quickly, steering the crawler to the right. The sled skidded dangerously close to the crater's edge. The mother dragon extended her wings slightly, shifting her weight to help balance the sled. It was a small movement, but enough to prevent the sled from tipping. He whispered a grateful word. Even though she couldn't hear him through the storm dot, the journey felt endless. The base wasn't far, but the storm made it feel like he was driving across an entire world. Each second stretched longer than the last. His eyes burned from focusing on the path. His hands cramped from gripping the controls. But slowly, through the thick dust, the outline of the base started to appear. Its tall metal towers shimmered under emergency lights. The moment he saw it, relief nearly made him collapse. He pushed the crawler forward, guiding it toward the entrance tunnel. As soon as they reached it, automated doors opened, welcoming them with warm light and calm air. The crawler rolled inside, and the storm's roar faded behind them like a distant memory. The engineer shut off the engine and climbed out. When he turned toward the sled, he saw something that made a lump rise in his throat. The mother dragon looked completely exhausted, but when she saw him, her eyes softened the same way they had earlier. The smallest hatchling pressed its tiny nose against the pod, all as if cheering quietly. They had made it. They were all alive, and deep inside, he knew this bond wasn't just survival anymore. It was something far stronger, something that would change everything. When the engineer reached the shelter with the dragon and her hatchlings, he felt the weight of everything that had happened. His arms were shaking from exhaustion, and dust still clung to his clothes. The storm outside had calmed, but the memory of rushing across that unstable ground stayed fresh in his mind. The dragon lay close to the heating units he had set up inside the shelter. She breathed slowly, still weak but finally safe. Her hatchlings explored the space with tiny steps, bumping into walls, tripping over each other, and chirping softly when they found something new. The engineer couldn't help smiling at the sound. Hours earlier, he thought this creature might lash out at him the moment he came near. Now her young moved freely around him without fear. One of them even tried chewing on the edge of his boot. He gently nudged it away, and it responded with a small cry, that brought the mother's head up. For a moment, she looked worried, but when she saw the engineer wasn't harming her child, she lowered her head again with surprising calm. He settled onto a metal crate and let out a slow breath. His whole body ached. His knee was bruised from when he got trapped under the fallen debris, and his back felt stiff from carrying equipment across the rough surface. Still, he felt lighter inside than he had in days. He hadn't expected any of this. He only wanted to make sure a forgotten creature wasn't left to die. But now he felt something deeper growing, something he couldn't fully explain. It wasn't just the relief of saving them. It was the strange trust forming between him and the dragon family. He checked the data unit mounted to the shelter wall. It showed that the rest of the crew was already returning to the area. They must have seen the storm recordings and realized something unusual had happened. He knew they would not be happy. They had filed an official report earlier stating that the dragon was too dangerous and the situation too unstable. They had justified leaving her behind as a necessary step for safety. Now they would see that she had been saved, and the story they tried to seal away would surface again. The engineer stood up, wiping sweat from his forehead. He wasn't afraid, but he also wasn't looking forward to the confrontation. He glanced at the dragon. Her eyes, pale and bright, met his. She didn't growl or move. She simply watched him with a calm that felt almost thoughtful. He stepped out of the shelter to wait for the crew. The air was cold and thin, but the storm clouds had cleared enough that soft light spilled across the rocky ground. His heart thumped as he saw the transport vehicle in the distance. It moved slowly, kicking up dust as it approached. When it stopped a few meters away, several crew members stepped out with confused expressions. They didn't look angry at first. They just looked surprised, as if they couldn't believe he was standing there unharmed. One of them called out, "We thought you were stuck in the storm." "What happened?" The engineer didn't raise his voice. He simply answered, "I went back for the dragon and her hatchlings." Their expressions shifted immediately. Some looked stunned. Others looked frustrated, and one person let out a disbelieving laugh. "You went back? For that creature? Why?" He didn't argue. He only said, "She wasn't beyond recovery. She was just abandoned." The group exchanged glances, almost as if they hoped he was joking. But when the engineer stepped aside, revealing the shelter behind him, their faces changed completely. They could see the pale shape of the mother dragon through the opening. They could hear the hatchlings chirping and moving around. There was no doubt at all. The dragon was alive, awake, and surprisingly calm. One person took a step back. "That thing should be dangerous," they muttered. "It would have been," the engineer replied quietly, "if she hadn't seen that someone cared enough to help." The crew didn't seem convinced. Some started to take slow steps toward the shelter. The engineer raised a hand, not to threaten them, but to warn them gently. "Don't rush in. She's still protective of her young." Before he could say more, a deep sound rippled from inside the shelter. Not a roar, but a low, rumbling warning. The dragon had sensed the unfamiliar voices. Her hatchlings hurried back to her side, pressing their small bodies under her wings. The engineer stepped forward calmly and said, "She won't attack unless she feels threatened." One of the crew members folded their arms. "This is risky. We can't let a creature like that stay here. We don't know what she can do." The engineer felt frustration rising inside him. "She already showed what she can do," he said. "She saved my life." The group fell silent. They didn't expect that answer. The engineer told them, briefly but clearly, how the debris had trapped him and how the dragon freed him when she could have simply flown away with her young. It was a simple moment, but it carried a weight that none of the crew could ignore. They stood uncertainly outside the shelter. After a long pause, one of them sighed. "Even if she helped you, This situation is complicated. Higher authorities will want reports and explanations. They'll get them, the engineer said, keeping his tone steady. And I'll make sure the truth is in those reports. Before the crew could respond, a sound echoed from inside the shelter, a heavy step, followed by another. The dragon slowly moved forward, stopping at the entrance. She positioned herself between the engineer and the rest of the crew. Her wings were partially spread, not in aggression, but in a quiet, protective gesture. The hatchlings peeked out from behind her, their eyes wide but curious. The crew looked alarmed, but the engineer didn't move. He knew she wasn't attacking. She was simply standing with him, showing the same trust he had shown her. She sees me as part of her nest now, he said softly. She won't hurt anyone if you stay calm. Some of the crew backed away. Others simply stared, unable to understand how such a fierce creature could look so gentle in that moment. Her pale scales caught the soft light, giving her an almost peaceful appearance. It was hard to imagine this was the same creature they once feared. The engineer slowly approached her, placing his hand lightly on her shoulder. The dragon lowered her head in response, and the hatchlings chirped, climbing onto his boots again. The crew watched with wide eyes. There was no denying it anymore. Something rare and extraordinary had formed between the human and the alien creature. Later, when more officials arrived and the situation was fully investigated, the engineer wrote a detailed report about everything that happened. He explained how compassion and patience allowed him to reach the dragon. He explained how she protected him, how she cared for her young, and how she reacted not with violence, but with understanding. His words carried weight because they came from real experience, not fear. Word spread quickly around the colony. Many people had grown up hearing stories about the species, calling them wild, unpredictable, or impossible to approach. Now they saw a different side. The dragon became a symbol not of danger, but of resilience and unexpected trust. Days passed, and the engineer visited the shelter every morning. The dragon grew stronger each day, and her hatchlings became more playful. They followed him around, chirping for food or climbing over his equipment with childish curiosity. The mother watched quietly, no longer tense, as if she knew he would take care of them. Sometimes he sat near her, and she nudged him gently with her nose, a sign of acceptance he never thought he would witness. The bond between them was no longer fragile. It had settled into something steady and rare. People from the colony began visiting the shelter one by one, standing behind safety shields at first, amazed when the dragon didn't react with hostility. The engineer always stayed near her, showing that she could be calm around humans. Slowly, the colony's fear faded into curiosity, then into respect. In time, the shelter was expanded into a protected habitat, giving the dragon and her young a safe place to grow. The engineer helped design every part of it. He had gone from someone who simply repaired machines to someone who helped repair a broken understanding between species. He never forgot the moment he first saw her lying on the unstable ground, weak and alone. And he never forgot how she used her last bit of strength to save him. What started as an act of simple kindness had grown into something larger, something that changed not only her future, but his as well. The dragon, now healthier and calmer, often rested near the open field outside the habitat. The engineer would sit beside her, watching the sky while the hatchlings played nearby. He didn't think of himself as a hero. He was just someone who chose not to walk away when he saw life in danger. But the bond he had formed made him realize how powerful one decision could be. The crew eventually accepted what he had done. Some even apologized for doubting him. They didn't fully understand the connection between him and the dragon, but they saw how real it was. They saw how her gentle behavior contradicted all their old assumptions. The engineer continued writing more detailed notes, hoping future researchers would understand that compassion could achieve what fear never could. If a human and an alien dragon could bridge such a wide gap, maybe other species could too. As weeks passed, the dragon would often lift her head whenever she saw him approaching, almost like she was greeting him. The hatchlings ran toward him every time, calling out in their tiny voices. He laughed every time this happened, feeling the warmth of their trust. He realized something simple but powerful. He hadn't only saved them. In some quiet way, they had saved him too. They had.